of preschool leaders.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Majid. Good afternoon, everyone. It's quite a long presentation, but I'll try to make it as concise as possible. This was a qualitative study that I did with a few of my colleagues. And it's a very small scale qualitative study involving only 15 preschool leaders. The reason that we did this study was because there have been a lot of changes in the Singapore preschool education sector, which is not yet under compulsory education. So compulsory education is only in primary school. So, but I think the recent changes is signaling a move by the Singapore government to put in a lot more resources in the preschool sector. So I think I will not go through all this. I think it's quite, makes sense for most that preschool education is important. But I think the challenge is really on the funding, the resources, and accessibility of good preschool programs. Right? In Singapore, it's not very much different. However, like what I mentioned earlier, because the preschool sector is not yet compulsory, it's not nationalized, so the providers have largely been left to market forces. It's mostly from the private sector. And there have been a lot of complaints of very high preschool fees for quality education. If I can just share with you, for 1 month of preschool fees in Singapore, the cheapest would be 500 Singapore dollars, which is about 5,000 Turkish lira. The most expensive would be 2,000 Singapore dollars, which is 20,000 Turkish lira a month. So because it's largely run by the private sector, the fees have gone up very high. So this is one of the reasons that the government has come in and decided that we will regulate a lot more so that it can become a lot more affordable, especially for low-income families. So there are more subsidies provided for low-income families, and it's really targeted. And the support is really provided to working mothers. So the good news is that if you're a working mother, you have even more subsidies so that you can continue to work and yet put your child in a childcare center or preschool so that you get that support. So the government provides a lot of subsidies. So you end up paying only like 20 Singapore dollars or 200 lira, Turkish lira a month, which is very much different from what you have to pay out of your own pocket. So there have been many changes in the last, I would say, 5 to 10 years. And this was the reason why we wanted to find out from our preschool leaders what they make of these changes. How will that affect them as preschool leaders in running their preschool centers or childcare centers, and how that will impact them in the long run. So the recent developments was we had the Early Childhood Development Agency set up. We had anchor operators, meaning they were originally private sector, but they come under the anchor operator scheme, which is funded by the government, so they can lower the fees, becomes a lot more affordable. And then they have, second is the National Institute of Early Childhood. The thing in Singapore is that if you want to teach in a school, you cannot just get a degree and go ahead and teach. You have to go through the National Institute of Education, be trained. It's the only institute that trains teachers so that you can be deployed to teach in primary and secondary schools. But that's only for primary and secondary schools. So in 2017, the government decided that we'll extend this to the preschool sector so that all preschool teachers will be trained centrally and will get the same amount of training and the same quality of training. Then there's a pilot for MOE kindergartens. MOE, the Ministry of Education. So like what I mentioned, the government decided that maybe it's time for the ministry to come in and do a lot more for the preschool sector, to nationalize it. So this is a very significant move because this has dismantled the government's initial belief that preschool education should be left to the private sector or to market forces. We also had the SPARK framework, the Singapore Preschool Accreditation Framework. This is to accredit all preschools to make sure that they have the same amount of quality for all preschools, regardless of whether they're under the government or the private sector. And finally, POP scheme, the Partner Operator Scheme. Again, these are private operators. They come under the POP scheme. The fees are not that low, but it's much lower than the private players, private sector players. So what we wanted to do was really to find out from the preschool leaders, what do they perceive of these changes, what their concerns are, how they manage and lead change, and what is the impact on their teachers as well as on themselves as leaders. So just two RQs, two research questions. One is, what do they understand about recent policy changes regarding the preschool sector in Singapore? And what do they understand to be the impact of these changes on the roles and responsibilities of preschool leaders and teachers? So it's individual face-to-face interviews with the 15 preschool leaders and teachers. This was done in 2019, and then COVID hit, so a lot of things got delayed. So that's why we only managed to publish this only now. 6 of them were from the anchor operator preschools, while the remaining 9 were from the non-AOP preschools. And each interview session lasted about 1 hour to 1.5 hours, audio recorded, audio transcribed, and we used NVivo, the software, to help us with the thematic analysis. So these are the participants that we included. You can see that some of them are very, very well experienced, more than 20 years of experience. Some are relatively new. So it was a good mix. And the main findings, there were essentially 6 areas that we identified. Yeah? The first is that the setting up of the ECDA, Early Childhood Development Agency, because this is the agency that regulated the entire preschool sector. So the preschool leaders were affected by this because generally they were very supportive because they felt that it provides greater legitimacy to the preschool sector. It's become a lot more well-regulated. And it was also a way to sieve out the poor quality preschools, right? So that only the really good quality ones are left behind because of the agency which regulates the entire sector. 2 is the framework. Not just the agency alone, but the framework itself provides a set of very clear guidelines on what preschools need to be able to achieve and attain in order to be considered a good quality preschool. But then participants also said that the process of getting the Spark accredited preschool was very stressful because you have to go through, make sure that you fulfill all the different criteria. Okay. Third is the consolidation. So what happened for some of the very small preschool centers, in order to be well accredited under the Spark framework, they actually joined up. So you have a few small preschool centers that actually joined up to become a mega center, so that they can draw on their different resources and different areas of expertise, so that they can fulfill the different criteria required by the Spark framework. So you have some preschools which are initially very small, but because they joined up, they consolidated, they became mega centers. So it was actually a good way to pool resources. Then the Ministry of Education set up the kindergartens, which is a move to nationalize preschool, which was very different from during the time or when I was in preschool many, many moons ago, 40 years ago. That was really all privately run. Now at least you have the MOE kindergartens, which ensured good quality, but at the same time very low cost, but very affordable. Because it's also under the government, the salaries of the teachers are very high. So you found that a lot of the teachers from the other private schools were leaving the private centers, joining the MOE kindergartens, because the pay is higher, the schools are better furnished, better infrastructure, and so on, and they see the better future for themselves as teachers and leaders. So the NIEC, the National Institute of Early Childhood Education, was set up in the National Institute of Education under the Nanyang Technological University. And this is where all the teachers are centrally trained to get their qualification before they can be deployed out to teach in the preschool centers. So like what I mentioned earlier, in Singapore, it's a little bit different. All teachers in primary and secondary school and now in the preschool need to be centrally trained, so that to ensure that there's a standard level of quality and qualification. And finally, the minimum qualifications of preschool teachers were actually raised. In the past, you just need a minimum, I think just O levels, but then it has been increased to at least 3 to 5 GCE O level passes with minimum of B4 in English language. So this as a whole has increased the perception that the preschool sector is now taking better quality teachers, more qualified teachers. So one, in terms of this discussion, if we can just group them, is the structure in itself. The fact that in Singapore, the government put everything in very specific structure, the MOE kindergartens, the anchor operators, the partner operators, sends a very strong signal to parents as well as the industry that the government is really regulating the sector, no longer leaving it to just market forces, because this is a way to ensure quality, but also at the same time ensure affordability, that people can afford to pay the fees. It will not be like 2,000 Singapore dollars a month. It can be much lower, a few $100s, but the quality is well assured. Two, the regulatory framework, again, to ensure quality of the curriculum, quality of the teachers, and quality of the overall sector in itself. And third, in terms of the teacher training, is again centralized. It's no longer just you have an O-level, GCE level qualification and you can teach in the schools. No longer that. You need to have your basic GCE level qualification, but you need to be centrally trained in order to get your teaching qualification. So in conclusion, I think the three significant overarching changes, the structure, the accreditation, as well as the qualification of teachers, these are very significant moves in the Singapore preschool education sector over the past 5 to 10 years. That has brought about a lot of positive outcomes, constructive developments. At least now, parents are seeing preschool teachers as professionals in their own right. In the past, parents used to treat preschool teachers as just babysitters, nannies. You're just taking care of my child during the day and that's it. But now parents are seeing preschool teachers as professionals who are well qualified, who are well trained. However, okay, of course, the quality of preschool education has improved. We have seen that over the past 5 years. But at the same time, I think there's also some misgivings, especially the smaller preschool and private players. They feel that the government is trying to now monopolize the entire sector. So some preschools, they are worried about their own existence, whether they can continue, because they are losing their teachers to the big preschool centers. They are not able to compete with the level of infrastructure and resources. So there are some misgivings. But I think for parents and the sector as a whole, I think it's a good improvement that the government is coming in to nationalize it. But we also know that the preschool leaders need to stay abreast. They need to keep up with the changes. They need to continue their training and upgrading, and that they need to be able to lead these changes as we go on for the next 10, 20 years. So that's all. Thank you very much.